Something that's been kind of weird inversion for me in a leadership position at a hyper growth company. It's in some ways I have a lot of power. And yet there's also, I think, a kind of humility or submission that's required. I think the more we've grown and the more I've grown his leadership position, the more I've recognized that you have to commit to the vision first. And then beyond that, physics has like decided what the job is or like what the company needs from you. And you have to listen to those signals. And that often means maybe not doing the thing that is directly aligned with like your pride.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Building with AI, the show where we dive into the minds of people shaping the future of artificial intelligence, one real-world application at a time. Today, I'm joined by someone whose journey from jazz musician to machine learning researcher to startup co-founder is as inspiring as it is unconventional. Zach Lipton is the Chief Scientific and Technology Officer at Abridge, one of the fastest-growing AI healthcare companies in the world. If you haven't heard, Abridge just recently raised a $300 million Series E at a $5.3 billion valuation, and they're on a mission to revolutionize how clinical documentation happens, using Ambient AI to transform the doctor-patient encounter. In this episode, Zach and I dig into how his personal medical experience led him from academia to co-founding Abridge, what it's like to go from building early neural network models for EHRs to deploying AI at scale in hospitals today, how Abridge is moving beyond just notes to full-blown contextual reasoning and real-time clinical decision support, what it takes to integrate deeply into complex systems like Epic, and how he thinks about model safety, privacy, and building a culture of scientific rigor inside of a high-growth company. We also talk about the LLM moment, how tools like ChatGPT changed public expectation, and what it really means to bring that power into regulated, mission-critical environments like healthcare. This was one of the most insight-rich conversations I've had on the podcast. So whether you're an AI practitioner, a healthcare entrepreneur, or just AI curious, there's a lot to learn here. All right, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Zach Lipton from Abridge. This episode of Building with AI is brought to you by Autoblocks, the company I founded to solve one of the biggest challenges in AI today, making LLMs safe, reliable, compliant, especially in high-stakes industries like healthcare. If you're a company building AI-powered products, whether that's a virtual health assistant, AI-driven documentation, or any LLM handling sensitive information, you know the risks. LLMs hallucinate, they leak sensitive data, and in regulated industries like healthcare, finance, and insurance, compliance isn't just important, it's a law. So what's the challenge? Most companies rely on manual spot checking and vague governance policies. That's not scalable. What you really need is a way to proactively catch AI failures before they happen, before an LLM suggests incorrect medical advice or violates HIPAA compliance. That's where Autoblocks comes in. We're an automated QA and compliance platform for LLM products, purpose-built for regulated industries. With Autoblocks, your team can run structured AI evals, detect risks before deployment, and enforce real-time guardrails in production, all while maintaining auditability and compliance. We're already helping companies like Hinge Health, Pelago Health, and others scale AI safely. If you're building AI for healthcare, finance, or any industry where safety and compliance matters, you need to be using Autoblocks. Go to autoblocks.ai to learn more or book a demo today. Again, that's autoblocks.ai, the trust layer for AI in regulated industries. Now, back to the episode. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, I'm super excited to have you here. It's always fun chatting with you. And I want to first start off with your story. How did you go from academia to co-founding and leading Abridge?
Sure. You can go all the way back. Grew up in New Rochelle, New York, kind of commuter suburb. Did my undergraduate studies at Columbia University. I was maybe a somewhat late bloomer as a technologist. And I would most of my life was obsessed with jazz music. Like music was my first love, and I got exposed to software, to algorithms, to computational thinking during my undergrad. I stayed with music, and so that continued to be my life through my early 20s. But I had a personal health setback in my 20s. There's some areas where medicine really knows what's going on and where the body's more mechanical, and there's some other areas, especially a lot of autoimmunity, where they're just kind of like, I don't know what's going on. Let's try steroids and see if you feel better. And then they try to figure out how to get you off steroids. And it's kind of a mess. That experience was pretty transformative for me, of seeing how much guesswork there was in medicine, how despite the fact that there are so many doctors having so many experiences with patients across the country, like how few of those experiences actually found a way to become useful data that informed how other people could practice. So it felt like there was this just missed epistemic opportunity. If you looked across it, there was like a people problem, there was like a systems problem. People weren't sharing because they were worried about security, privacy. There were regulatory hurdles. There was a sense of proprietariness to data that people were disinclined to share. There was a computational thing, just like what are the systems that are going to actually pull all this that's stored differently across all the institutions and connect them. So there was like a kind of software level computational concern, but then there was also a more algorithms or statistical level problem. Even if you had all the data in the world, what would you do with it? And that's not a straightforward question. It's one thing to paint a bunch of descriptive statistics, but how do you go to like actual actionable information? How do you read causal insights out of longitudinal data is one of like the great challenges in science. So I came out of that experience thinking, hey, I want to have an impact in healthcare. And I'm 27 years old at the time already. One route is maybe I could try to do an MD PhD and become a doctor scientist. And I'd probably still be in school right now if I had gone that route. I had a moment where it kind of came together at once. Like, I want to go to grad school. But in a very quick period of time, landed on this thesis that the way that I could maybe impact healthcare, given where I was coming from, what I spiked on, what I didn't, what I had time for, given the stage of life. And I think when you're in your late 20s, sometimes in retrospect, it looks silly, but you could feel like, hey, time's running out, or I got to get started on something. I don't want to be 40 when I get my first job. So I ended up moving out to California, spent some time kind of brushing up my technical skills, co-founding a health tech startup, but also applying to PhD programs. And I got in. So I was joining the field of AI, or at the time, AI was sort of the out of fashion word that was stigmatized from a previous period of overhype and underdeliverance. There's a PhD in machine learning. But that was the community that birthed really the sort of like modern discipline of building with neural networks. And so the deep learning boom was at its infancy. I started my PhD fall 2013. AlexNet had maybe just hit 6 months before, and it was still catching people flat-footed. Like the shockwave was at its very beginning. People's perception of neural networks was like, you know, like, yeah, something like this stuff works for OCR. That's like a niche, weird area, but otherwise, neural networks don't really work. And that was the environment that I got into, and I rode that shockwave of deep learning being something not on people's radar to how we sort of the backbone for how we build everything with AI these days. I got to build the first applications of modern neural networks to electronic health record data. Ended up with 1 foot in like foundational methodological world and 1 foot in healthcare applications. So I always had running applications. I was funded by National Library of Medicine. I had collaborations with doctors at UCSD, where I did my PhD, but also built a collaboration with the pediatric intensive care unit at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, collaborated with the Cleveland Clinic, ended up also spending a lot of my PhD rotating in and out of industry labs because it was a crazy moment. All of our professors were getting poached into industry briefly. So I did 2 stints at Amazon and 2 stints at Microsoft Research Labs. And during the last stint at Amazon, I got offered a professorship at Carnegie Mellon. So I had found PMF, you could say, in my research career. And so I moved to Pittsburgh. And probably the first professional contact that I made in Pittsburgh was I was looking for medical collaborators in Pittsburgh, because it was always important to me. This side of my research, this was always part of my research personality, was trying to find applications in healthcare and make an impact. So I was showing up at Carnegie Mellon, which doesn't have a medical school. And so I was trying to figure out basically, how do I get in touch with people at UPMC? Because UPMC and Highmark Health really are the 2 big sort of like medical institutions, Allegheny Health Network and UPMC. And I happened to have a chance encounter with the chief of medicine at UPMC. That was my first kind of medical contact there. And he was basically at the time feeling pressure on his end, because it was like 2017. Everyone's talking about AI is going to automate radiology. What's your AI strategy? And they didn't really have much of an AI strategy. It was very new. Hospital systems were also getting caught. If the research community was getting caught flat-footed that neural networks were taking over the world in 2013, then maybe these other bigger institutions were first sort of getting on their radar, maybe 2017, 2018. So, from my perspective, it was like, oh, I've got the chief of medicine on the line. And from his perspective, it was like, oh, I've got this young professor at Carnegie Mellon who really wants to collaborate on deep learning. It's great. He ended up connecting me to like top brass EPMC, but the most important contact was EVP of UPMC Enterprises, basically a cardiologist who was half-time cardiologist, half-time corporate VC for UPMC, running their grant writing, investments in health tech startups, their overall like kind of technology strategy there. And that was Shiv Rao, who's the CEO of Abridge. So we ended up meeting and we became fast friends. And it was a few months later where he basically was like, hey, I'm going to start this company. And he gave me the idea. And he's got this great ability to zoom out. And so I think he was seeing a few currents happening all at once, which is like progress in NLP, progress in speech, kind of like where the puck was moving in AI. And then also at the same time seeing the burnout crisis. And also had this like business standpoint of had seen all these companies come and fail in healthcare, and had like really been a student of like why did the very few succeed, and like why was everyone else failing to get in, and really appreciated not just that you needed cool technology, but you needed to have a real strong angle for where you plug in the workflow. And landed on thesis that the conversation was the missed opportunity. You need to be in the conversation. That's the way to wedge into healthcare. And he saw all those points and saw if you were in the conversation, you could write the notes, you could do this. Of course, at the time, I'm also a pragmatic builder. So I'm like, that the context, these conversations are 4,000, 10,000 words long. And the best models at the time could look at 128 or 256 words of context. So there was like a gap between where the tech was and the vision. But it was really exciting. So I signed up initially really more on the R&D side than on the operator side. And we started the company back 2018. And then maybe, 3 years ago, I jumped into the kind of executive operator role, initially as chief scientist, and then took over more broadly the builder organization.
It's really interesting when you describe your story, because it's also a story of the progress that we've made in the AI space and the step function improvements that we've made to certain use cases, especially around processing natural language. And you hinted at these applications, these specialized, supervised learning applications that were useful, but maybe were not practical for things like analyzing conversations in an intelligent way. And things like LSTMs were exciting technologies, but they weren't necessarily going to get us to this end state that we had envisioned very early on. But you set out to solve that specific problem with Shiv. And you described a little bit of what Abridge originally set out to solve. I'm especially curious to learn about the LLM moment. How did that journey evolve and unfold for you? Seeing the technological limitations of things like LSTMs with regular NLP over to using LLMs as a way of introducing more intelligence and reasoning capabilities, quote unquote, into some of these workflows.
Maybe like I'll break two paths to go down here. One is the steps that the company took and evolving more on the like vision product side. And then the other side is, hey, how did things move in terms of methods? On the product side, it's interesting. I think we already knew that AI scribing was like an obvious killer application. And that if you could do it, the number of adjacencies was absolutely insane. And so the only question was, when would we be able to do that? So well that it was a viable product. And so we were doing two things. Me on the research side, I was focusing on note creation from very early on. We had funding at the lab at CMU. I was originally much more research hat on, research collaboration kind of role, and focus on that. On the go-to-market side, that in the meanwhile, the company was kind of experimenting with different ways of like, how do you lay the tracks? How do you get inside the conversation? So there was a patient-facing app, which was great, but also limited because you have to be much more cautious showing information direct to a patient versus to a doctor who's in a position to be the human in the loop, the responsible intermediary. There was an attempt to get into telehealth during COVID. And all those things were little plays to say, like, is there a way to get inside the conversation and start delivering some value during that interim period? But I was always on the node creation side. So from my perspective, when I stepped into being a true operator was when we hit that moment of realizing we can make nodes viable. And this was the chance to be both feet and make it work. So from my perspective, the vision was strangely consistent, but that's also because I had blinders on and was focused on what eventually became the flagship product. Meanwhile, the company had its sort of more serpentine journey to get there. From my perspective, then, right, it's the evolution that we're seeing was largely technological. We were using like very narrow, purpose-built LSTMs for random initialization, and then ChatGPT or something came out, and there's a whole paradigm of orchestrated workflows and like agentic design. There are a lot of steps in the middle. From 2018 already was like the era of BERT, sort of like BART, Roberta, like kind of like the transformer based, a lot of different ideas in the air about how to pre-train effectively. I think the primacy of pure decoder only language model pre-training as like the backbone of everything wasn't as entrenched. So you had a lot of these models trained with different kinds of pre-trained workflows. BERT did dropping out random words and trying to reconstitute them. So like the prediction tasks fill in the blanks. There were elements that survived into other models that like T5. In each of these models also, there was kind of step ups in the size of the models and people starting to see results. There was this kind of gradual thing. People were starting to recognize transformer architecture. Transformer is a kind of weird thing because I think we overplay the difference from LSTMs. In some ways, like the biggest thing was an efficiency thing. It was like an addition by subtraction, because it was the recognition that, hey, if like you already had recurrent networks with attention layers. So it was really this recognition that, hey, if you had put enough parameters into the attention mechanism, and if you equip the models with these positional embeddings, you could drop the recurrent connections altogether. And by virtue of doing that, kind of break this left to right computational bottleneck. So you suddenly made it more efficient to compute these things and could tolerate models that had many more parameters. The movement to transformers is one thing, but largely I think the bigger thing is probably with enough engineering, we could have gotten LSTMs to do more or less what we're doing right now. And I think there have been a good number of subsequent papers kind of catching up, showing roughly equivalent perform, but it's just the whole stack is so heavily optimized around transformers right now. It's hard to disentangle that. I think that the big move was scaling up from a standpoint of like compute, model size, data, and a recognition suddenly that we crossed into a new paradigm where you could create model behaviors without training from scratch at all. And that opened up this whole new cadence of development, because you still had the ability to train models from scratch. You still had the ability to fine-tune models, but you also had this ability to prompt your way to a behavior or to a modification in behavior. And so you had this ability to get something in front of people, get feedback, and now a mechanism to be able to tweak the feedback, take the feedback, and modulate the behavior of the product on a very short kind of turnaround and get it back in people's hands and get feedback. And so prompt engineering, it kind of, it's still a bit of a wild west. And I think the production patterns are still quite constantly in flux and quite heterogeneous across places. But there's this dance where like the basic ingredients are, you have the ability to prompt your way to a behavior, the ability to layer on multiple calls, potentially to different models in sequence, so that if you've got something that's mostly doing what you want, but now there's a particular failure mode, you could add on a call that's a guardrail or a post-processing step. Then you also have this other kind of ability, which is like a kind of, if you've built out a kind of Byzantine workflow, the ability to condense it into a single model call with going back to model training. So we would call that distillation. Suddenly we have this repertoire of building a behavior, extending it, refining it, distilling it, extending it. And it's this whole dance of ornamentation and condensation that is sort of the modern LLM-based design pattern. And, the earliest stages of that became maybe evident with like GPT-3, And people were already starting to get to like kind of zero shot, few shot prompt models, chain of thought models that were hitting capabilities and doing things that previously people had been unable to do, even when they were trying to purposely train on bespoke data for that task. It was this crossing over point. I think there were already glimmers maybe around like GPT-2 era scale that prompting could create like capabilities, but they were a crossing over point into, hey, we could do things that weren't just matching what we did before in the old paradigm, but in many cases exceeding it. I'd say that one thing that the language model advancements gave was a new set of primitives for design. But the other big thing was just the very existence and success of ChatGPT itself as a product was a major, I think, just change in the psyche of the public, that went from a world where when I started working on language modeling in 2013, my parents were like, I don't know what this AI stuff is, but I suppose getting a PhD is more stable than being a musician. By 2022, suddenly it was like your parents, like your grandparents were asking you about ChatGPT, and they probably knew something about it that like you hadn't heard yet, because it had become part of people's daily lives. It had become part of the mainstream news cycle. And I think that level of familiarization, just that the fact that sort of like later career executive types in traditional businesses knew about ChatGPT and were primed, like, oh, AI does this, and that now. There was less of a feeling when you were talking to people. It felt less like they were like indulging a sci-fi conversation about what the future might be like. There was a change in expectation suddenly. Like, this kind of thing is going to happen now. That just created a readiness from a go-to-market standpoint. And I think it was all very palpable, say like December 2022, that how things were going to change.
That was a 5 to 10 minute masterclass of where we've been and where we are today. It was an excellent walkthrough. So for people who are unfamiliar with ambient AI in healthcare, how would you explain what Abridge does?
Sure. Abridge is an AI platform for clinical conversations. It is writing alongside the doctor during the doctor-patient encounter. And in the background, it's automatically performing, or at least drafting, all of the administrative outputs that normally would bog down all the peanut butter in the doctor's workflow. To give some context here, right now, doctors spend about 2 hours doing administrative work, paperwork. It's now mostly electronic, but for every 1 hour of direct patient care. So that means they're spending more time kind of putzing around on the computer than they are making eye contact with the patient, thinking about their case, explaining them, making treatment decisions. What we do basically is the workflows. The doctor comes in to visit with the patient. They say, hi, this is my AI assistant. It helps me with my note taking so I can be more present with you. Would you be okay if we recorded the conversation? The patient consents, they hit record. Then Abridge kind of disappears into the background. Everyone's had this experience of going to the doctor where the doctor is standing with their back to the patient, typing against a wall. And instead of doing that, the doctor really only consults the computer when they really need to look something up. But otherwise, they let their note taking go. And they spend their time talking to the patient, making eye contact with the patient, focusing on their needs, focusing on human connection. And Abridge is in the background listening to the conversation. It's transcribing every chunk of audio that comes in. It is structuring that data. It's assembling all that after visit documentation. So it's drafting the history, the assessment, the plan, the physical exam, the social history, family medical history, past medical history. It is drafting the after visit instructions for the patient. It's drafting the orders that are going to be entered into the EHR. So that way, when the doctor is done with the visit, they hit stop recording within seconds. They have all of their paperwork drafted for them and ready for review. It's still important that the doctor goes through this work and confirms that everything is as they intended, or if they had some information in their head that for some reason they didn't speak aloud, they make sure that that gets into the note. But it's starting on the 5-yard line instead of starting kickoff reception.
Yeah, and you mentioned there's been a change in expectations. People are a lot more intimately familiar with the power of applications like ChatGPT and transformer models and LLMs. But when it comes to taking that technology and applying it into settings that have been traditionally thought of as siloed, like working with EHRs, it presents a massive challenge for a lot of businesses. And a lot of folks may not necessarily understand how this technology can be applied in those settings. How deeply is Abridge integrated with EHRs like Epic, being the biggest one or most popular one? And what's the magic behind making sure that works smoothly for clinicians?
It just all starts with collaboration. We have a tremendous amount of respect for what Epic has built and recognize what a crucial role it plays in the workflows of all of our customers. So we set out from the very beginning with a kind of collaboration first mindset. I think a lot of startups, the thing that makes them successful or the thing that makes them attractive to VCs, as like kind of pathologically ambitious, they're like, I'm going to take over the world and I'm going to own everything. And I think we recognize in healthcare that like just what a Herculean amount of stuff the EHR does. And we were recognized that like we need to find our swim lane. And rather than, I think some startups get up and they're gonna be like, we're going to be the new EHR and we're going to be this and we're going to be that. And we didn't have any interest in going down that path. Our place to play is the conversation. This is like this great untapped resource, and we need to partner really tightly with the other kind of tech providers that constitute the backbone of the health system. So we built a relationship of kind of trust and collaboration with Epic over the course of years. And about almost 2 years ago, Epic named us as a partner in their workshop program. And so this was a program of co-development that helped to develop the integration pathway by which Abridge now lives inside the workflows of folks who are Epic users. So this includes things like an Ambient module. It includes the way that Ambient integrates into emergency visits and inpatient visits. It includes the fact that someone can access Abridge without even leaving the Epic application. You could pull up Haiku, the Epic app on your phone, and navigate to an Abridge tab inside Haiku, begin your recording. And that recording can show up directly inside Hyperspace, which is the Epic desktop app, within which there's an Abridge activity tab, which someone can navigate to, for example, to see the linked evidence that links, snippets in the transcript to corresponding parts of the note. So we've invested a lot of co-development cycles and partnership cycles in building a strong relationship with Epic. And I think that's been really key. I think Epic has a tremendous amount of trust with the health systems. And it's been a great relationship for us.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I know Abridge started off focusing on outpatient clinics, and Abridge has moved into inpatient, ED, and nursing workflows. What are some of the unique challenges in some of these new environments that may be distinct from the challenges of working with outpatient clinics?
Great question. There's integration differences. The application people used to record and the nurses used to record is called Rover, which is different from Haiku, which is the app that's used by physicians. So there's definitely like EHR integration things. There's output differences. Like what are the kinds of artifacts that you're creating for people? It could be different for these different provider types. So nurses, for example, like beginning of shift in an inpatient setting, inpatient nurses have to go and they have to fill out flow sheets. Imagine that like you had 400 Google Forms, and every time you encounter like a new situation, you need to go through and fill them all out. But it's not that every form is relevant to every situation. Across the 400 forms, there's maybe 8,000 form rows or input elements. And for any given situation you're in, maybe 40 of those are relevant. And now you need to go and figure out which rows need to be entered for whom. And then some of them have a little bit of free text aspect to it. Many of them are multiple choice. Some are kind of scalar, quantitative field. And this is your task. It's a different kind of challenge from a machine learning standpoint that you can't just like brute force go through every single row and like try to query an LLM for every single one because you spend an enormous amount of time and tokens and calls. So there's this combination of an aspect of retrieval, an aspect of form filling, and then a whole new integration pathway. So I'd be like how nursing would be very different from more narrative notes with more standardized sections. Emergency has its own interesting aspects. I think with emergency and inpatient, there's a few things. One of the biggest aspects is that we're getting more and more deep into expanding our offering to address this aspect, is that the patient's not there for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes. They could be there for 4 hours or 8 hours or 2 days. And so then there's this challenge of thinking, how do we connect the dots across these longer interactions? What kind of notes do you need at each step along the way? But also, what are ways that a bridge could serve as some amount of connective tissue, pulling together information discussed with one individual and another? There's a lot of challenges there for how to evolve the product to fully take advantage of the richness of the setting that are, not so salient in the outpatient setting. There's also just a lot of maybe more fine detail for each of these settings. That is, emergency department, for example, it's important for how they operate and how their work is documented and assessed and also ultimately compensated, that you document the processes of medical decision making, and that this is an important part of the artifact for emergency visits in a way that is somewhat distinct from how those things are accounted for and documented in most outpatient settings. So that's sort of maybe more on the level of the kind of customization that we do more broadly, like on a specialty by specialty basis. For example, a pediatric well visit looks very different than an adult visit. A history of present illness for a behavioral health exam looks very different than it does for a cardiology exam. So there's that level of customization and new sections, new subsections, specific types of reasoning that need to be documented, specific details that could never be omitted in certain settings that we have to be especially attentive to.
What's the reaction been from clinicians to using tools like the ones that Abridge is creating? I'm just curious, how are they finding it? And what is the type of feedback that you're seeing? Also, what are some of the challenges that they might be experiencing in terms of adjusting to this new workflow?
Feedback's been overwhelmingly positive. I think that's why we've seen just wild levels of adoption that we've seen in healthcare. I don't know if we could point to any kind of workflow transformation that's been quite the uptake of Ambient. In the past, when there's been a huge change, a huge technology change in healthcare, it's almost always been top down. And you've seen this before. There's a government mandate, or everyone has to migrate off paper records. Everyone has to do something. The pull for Ambient has largely been from the ground. It's been individual providers who have been clamoring for it, or even just like signing up and going rogue until their health systems like adopt an Ambient provider because they want it that badly. We've been lucky to deliver maybe the right product at a moment where the pain point is so extreme that even an industry that's normally slower moving technologically has been enthusiastic about taking it up. The positive side's been extreme, and it's I think a big part of what gives us energy as folks building a product like Abridge. We have a few channels in our Slack, and one of them is called Love Stories. Whether it's like out of the feedback that we get in app or out of things people say in emails that they write to our customer support or write to their partner experience teams, it's pretty wild. You have people saying they've been home for dinner with their family for the first time in 15 years. You have people saying like Abridge saved their marriage. So that's pretty wild. You also have a new product that is moving very fast. And there's a bunch of people who very constructively are just like extremely persnickety about, I want the note to look like this. And when this and this is mentioned, this should always be in this order. And this problem should always be listed before that one. And I prefer this format to that format. And oh, it missed this one detail. And God forbid, there's a misspelling and somewhere in the transcript. There's plenty of people who will take the opportunity to remind us. And we learn a tremendous amount from this kind of feedback, this constructive feedback. We're often able to turn around. Sometimes people catch a blind spot. For example, when it comes to spellings of any kind of like medical nomenclature, we're often able to ship an improvement in 24 or 48 hours. We've gotten that down to a science of being able to capture, especially for new medical jargon. So there's no shortage of features that people want. There's no shortage of opinions. And I would maybe group it into like a few categories. On one hand, people are giving us feedback about quality of product and things that are kind of like objective improvements that we get to work on and deliver, like bring latency down. Then there's also some amount that's feature requests, like people getting creative. A lot of features that we even have now are features that didn't exist before, but we were seeing a kind of grassroots clamoring. People wanted a certain level of control, or they wanted a certain kind of note type. But then I'd also add there's this other interesting dimension, which is that there's also a part that is a dialectic among physicians. Before, everyone would just write their own note, and there were people would be pretty doctrinaire. Some people about notes should be structured this way, and other people notes should be structured that way. And there wasn't necessarily like a forcing function towards uniformity or consistency or national standards. But in an interesting way, we're sitting in the middle here. And we play this interesting role where sometimes, you get to areas that enter true like subjective terrain. Some doctors want to know it this way, and others equally forcefully want it that way. And we have to be creative and think, where are the cases where there really is a way of structuring the note that satisfies the needs of both factions? Where are the differences so irreconcilable that the only way to do right by the doctor is to create maybe two different flavors and expose this as a user setting? But we're in this interesting role of helping to mediate a sort of indirect conversation among the zeitgeist about how should patient encounters be documented.
Yeah, and as you hinted at, Abridge lets clinicians personalize how their notes are structured, whether they're concise or verbose, narrative versus bullet points, and some of the nuances that you mentioned. How do you maintain quality control with that level of flexibility?
While we do expose a good amount of control, I think there's a lot of people that are just throwing caution to the wind. They're just kind of like, supply your own prompt kind of like level for everything, and quality control is on you. I think the problem with that is like then you could never stand by any kind of statement of quality, because you've got this completely ad hoc pipeline that is not just different in that there's a few moving parts, but it's different on a per individual basis. I think we've tried to have a principle here of to like sort of err on the side of tractability so that we can lean in on the rigor of evaluation. If you've got a small enough number of flavors, then these are ones that could actually be rigorously evaluated across hundreds or thousands of patient encounters. And we could stand by statements about accuracy, about quality, about we don't omit crucial medical details, and that confabulations are well controlled. And that's important to us to be able to, especially as an enterprise solution versus clinicians going guerrilla solution, to be able to stand by statements about quality and integrity. We do have some amount of tailoring, but I think we try to always figure out how do we max out the performance we can get in the sort of like more main branch side, and then really fork when we have to fork, because there's truly like a fundamental difference of preference or impasse. And then even there, where we've gotten creative, is to share technical DNA among the flavors. So maybe we'll have several different versions of a particular note, but actually there's a layer underneath that is the structuring layer, and we're able to do the evaluation at that layer. And so they share like, the module that is deciding which conditions are relevant for this particular encounter is the same regardless of what other pieces you move around. So we're doing more and more to decouple the content, maybe you might say, the underlying content from the upholstery. And then we're able to maybe make more stylistic or cosmetic changes while having a shared backbone. And it's the backbone that can be subject to the full strength of evaluation. And so we try to keep as much of the content in the part that is subject to a larger scale rigorous evaluation, and be selective about where we apply the more kind of cosmetic transformations.
It totally makes sense. And so I want to shift gears a little bit here, Zach. So I want to let you talk a little bit about some of the cool stuff that you're cooking up over at Abridge. So you recently launched Contextual Reasoning Engine. What is it, and how does it improve clinical notes?
If you could look at this journey from the very beginning, Ambient V0 is really conversation in, note out. So the only kind of context available to the model is the conversation itself. And what we've done is we've started on many different fronts to go way deeper in terms of the set of inputs that are able to inform the note that we're writing. So this includes pulling the visit diagnoses, the problem list, the prior notes for that patient, other structured data in the EHR, the physician specialty, the care setting, the patient's name, the clinician's name, their preferred pronouns, their health insurance information potentially. I guess maybe one thing I'd point out there is that there's a lot of information that you just fundamentally can't perfectly glean from the conversation alone. There might be cases where someone's there for their chemo treatment, but because they come in on a certain regular cadence, they don't restate the full detail of why are they there, what are they being treated for, exactly what is the staging of the cancer that they have. So there's a whole lot that's unspoken, but it lives in the subtext. The world that we're increasingly living in now is one where Abridge is able to hear what's going on in the conversation, but not just what's in the conversation, also able to look and say, this patient is seeing this doctor for this condition, and this chemo is what's part of the cancer plan for that. So this must be the problem that they are referencing, and able to now describe the problem with a higher level of specificity than they would if you were going based on the transcript alone. Or there's a world here where we're getting to where Abridge will be able to know in particular, oh, this patient is a Medicare Advantage patient and is being seen by this doctor for this particular condition, which corresponds to a risk adjustment category, but that they haven't been seen for before, which means that as part of the documentation, it's important to itemize and list certain kinds of information in the note such that it'll make this a smoother process for the clinician on the back end, and they won't get queries in the EHR 2 weeks later. It's this kind of awareness of the patient history, awareness of the problem list, awareness of the metadata, awareness of the structured data, awareness of the care plan information, and the associated kind of documentation criteria in order to lubricate all the downstream workflows that enables Abridge to create a note that is complete in a way that you couldn't if you were going from the transcript alone. So TLDR, a note that's more clinically useful by virtue of being more specific, but also a note that's more compliant, that's more billable, and that's more clerically useful also.
And is this only available in the note generation, or is this available for clinicians to leverage the contextual reasoning engine during the interactions with patients as well?
Great question. In general, we are a major area of active development for us, delivering more real-time value inside the conversation. I think there's too much technology that's interruptive, and there's too much technology that is annoying or getting in the way. And I think because our core mission is to sort of give people back human interaction, give people back quality time with patients, we've started on the side of being extremely passive and in the background, because I think that was like the most important place to start. It's core to our company's values. And I think while we're treading carefully, there definitely are cases where being present, able to query medical information in real time, to be able to notice in real time that you forgot to ask an important question that is going to result in this patient sort of being denied some medication that otherwise would get approved quickly, to be able to help people to not just document faster, but to actually have better conversations that result in better outcomes, whether clinically or administratively, for the patient. That's a major push of the company to deliver that value right at the point of care. And we're in a special position to do it because we're right in the doctor's hands.
You're in the conversation. So just stay tuned to everyone in the audience. So let's talk about billing. So Abridge is moving into real-time billing documentation. How do you see AI transforming revenue cycle management?
The revenue cycle in healthcare is bananas right now. There are so many moving parts and so many strange little fiefdoms. I think if you had a room covered wall to wall with 6 whiteboards, you could begin to describe maybe 1/3 of the players and what they're doing and where money's flowing. But even within the health system, there's just an insane kind of Byzantine process for how billing works and for how health systems kind of like ready their documentation to participate in each of the different billing paradigms. Risk adjustment would be a great example. Risk adjustment is a concept in a paradigm for medical billing called value-based care. The idea there is you should be rewarded for taking care of patients, and how much money you should get should depend somewhat on the complexity of the patient mix. But then beyond that, your incentive shouldn't just be to give more care, but should be to have better outcomes. And so the two big pieces are what is your patient mix and what are the quality scores for the care that you're giving. And the hope is to move doctors away from you get paid more for doing more to a world where you get paid more for having better outcomes more efficiently. And so within Medicare, there's the traditional Medicare, which is fee for service, the old paradigm. There's the new paradigm, which is value-based care. Within that, there's a question of what an institution gets paid is going to depend upon the patient mix. And the patient mix is going to be basically scored using a coding system called the HCC ontology, which sort of maps to like a subset of the ICD diagnosis codes. Now, there's a process both for which patients, for which conditions, can you bucket them under certain categories, and what is required to sort of receive that corresponding payment from CMS. And it could be different depending upon, is this a condition that is already, the patient's already known to have? First, is this a new condition that is suspected? And what needs to be shown and how? And it is this very complex system. And the doctors are not experts. The doctors are experts in treating patients. They're not experts in like, how does payment from CMS through the payer to the hospital system work within the value-based care paradigm? Like, that's not what they know about. What they know about is treating patients. And so what you wind up with is a system where the doctors are treating the patients. They're sort of engaged in a coding process, but they don't want to be engaged in the coding process. They didn't go to school for coding. They don't, it's not what they know. It's not what they care about. They're not 100% sure even how to do it right. They do their best. But then because the whole financial backbone of the system is based on coding and it's not what the doctors know, what you end up with is this crazy amount of like bureaucratic bloat that comes in behind the doctor. And it is a chain of systems that are all about trying to package up the documentation for purposes of participating in each of these sort of processes. And a doctor might see a patient who happens to be a Medicare Advantage patient. They try to write a strong clinical note. They code to the best of their ability. This doesn't just go directly to CMS. Now this is going through the back office of the health system. And there's a whole bunch of different folks who touch this note at different points in time. And they might say, oh, actually, we think that this condition corresponds to this HCC, but the doctor needs to sign off on it. And also, if they do sign off on it, then they need to also document X, Y, Z. And they'll then send a message to the doctor who 2 weeks later, they've already seen 500 patients since then. They have no idea, like they've completely forgotten the details of the case. Now they get an in-basket message, and it's from someone in the back office from risk adjustment who's like, hey, wait a minute, did you mean this? And if so, then you have to answer this question. Maybe the doctor ends up having to like get on the phone and call the patient to ask the question because they don't even remember the detail. But it's this ridiculous process where the documentation is swimming in circles inside the health system before it even gets out of the health system in order to make it well packaged such that it meets the needs of what has to be shown to whom and how in these various billing paradigms. The reason why you need to do this is because the doctor themselves is not the expert on these processes. That's not what they're expertly crafting their notes towards. A lot of these processes that maybe take weeks. And in the case of risk adjustment, okay, it's stopping the flow of money. In the case of prior authorization, it's actually delaying care. Patients might be receiving treatments or procedures or lab tests 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later than they should, because there's a bureaucratic process going on, taking weeks to cycle, maybe having back and forth between the provider and the insurance company, all before you get to a conclusion where there's no technical reason why you couldn't have done that all 100 times more efficiently at the point of care. And for us, what is special about the position that we have is that we are sitting inside the conversation. Sorry, it was a long answer, but I hope it gives some sense of all these processes where rather than wait 2 weeks to have like 4 layers of review to ultimately decide that you need a clarification from the doctor, that's a situation where maybe the doctor should just be able to look down at the app and it says, hey, did you mean this? Did you mean this? Or don't forget to ask the patient that. And I think as we start getting to that world with just being ever so slightly more active, maybe we wind up in a place where 30 seconds of work during the visit could save you an hour of work later.
And hopefully in the next 5-10 years, like this type of work is seen as archaic, having to do it as a clinician and deal with some of this grunt work. So I have one last question for you on the safety side, and then just a couple of quick fire questions to wrap up the call. On the safety side, so being in the conversation, you're obviously dealing with some of the most sensitive data in healthcare. What's your approach to privacy, security, and governance at a high level?
Sure. There are some AI unique aspects of thinking about privacy, like what do you train on, what kind of safeguards you need to ensure that there aren't model mediated leaks. But I think the lion's share of security concerns are just relate to the fundamental questions that everyone who handles sensitive data must deal with. It is just straight up having, I think, high integrity systems, having a mature cybersecurity program, having your PHI on lockdown, having secure product environments, having secure authentication with each of your customers. One nice thing about having grown to, we're not a tiny startup anymore, is we're able to make substantial investments in both product and company level security and privacy engineering. And this is actually a major thrust in this next phase of growth is building out a truly enterprise class security team. And that's something I've actually been meeting with a lot of leaders and amazing CISOs from across industry over the past weeks and months. And that's been a privilege, I think, coming from a different world of AI research, but entering another area of rarefied expertise to meet some amazing leaders.
This is actually a good segue into my next question, which is Abridge recently announced a $300 million Series E led by A16Z at a $5.3 billion valuation. What does that scale up and enable that wasn't possible before?
I think we're at an amazing moment for both sort of at the same time as we're scaling out in terms of like volumes, number of customers, range of deployments, and maybe scaling up from a standpoint of continuing to invest in our enterprise greatness of our offering. We've been talking about in this conversation where we sit in this really special place in the workflow. And really, I think your imagination's the limit for what other kinds of value can we provide, whether it's investments in what eventually becomes real-time Copilot on the clinical decision support side, or the more near-term nudges to help someone navigate documentation that's perfectly compliant for all these kind of revenue cycle workflows. There's this huge, incredible just buffet right now of product adjacencies to pursue. And we're living in a special moment for product development where it's, I think, never been more possible to go 0 to 1 on amazing ideas with just insane velocity. And I think that the new capital continues to support our ability to parallel path the trajectory towards scale, towards maturity, and a very aggressive push into exciting new product adjacencies. So that ability to go wide and deep simultaneously is always the biggest thing. Now, if you take two steps, like what's behind that, there's investments in talent, there's investments in compute, there's investments in infrastructure. A big part of enterprise greatness, especially if you look towards a future that has government customers and potentially international, there's a massive amount of infrastructure work that needs to be done to lay all those tracks, and we'll definitely be able to invest there. But I'd also just be remiss if I didn't point out that as much as the capital is great towards those ends, we've also been privileged to be building a very healthy business with a formidable war chest already. And so capital is never just about capital. To us, fortunate position we've been able to be in is to think of capital as first and foremost about partnerships. And so it's really largely a question of who we're working with, who's invested in our story, that has the ability to be a thought partner with us, to make connections for us, to help us to go places with our vision that we couldn't do alone. And so with A16Z and also with Khosla, what we see is two new amazing partners who obviously have storied histories and I think have the ability to open new possibilities and challenge us in new ways.
And Zach, a question that I had is, from research to founder of a multi-million-dollar tech startup, what has been the most surprising part for you?
I think there's a banal kind of trope about startup growth that is the job changes every 3 months or every 6 months, or the company changes every 6 months. And I think that's especially true in a leadership role, that what it is that you do that delivers value to the company looks very different at different points, like what the company needs from you. And I think in some ways, something that's been like a kind of weird inversion for me in a leadership position at a hyper growth company. It's in some ways I have a lot of power, or at least relative to, I don't know, 7 years ago, I was an intern at Amazon AI or something, or 8 years ago. And yet there's also, I think, a kind of I don't know, humility or submission that's required. I think as an IC researcher, I could have this attitude, and I did, which was very much, this is my art. This is what I do. Get the fuck out of my way. This is what the package is. I think that the more we've grown and the more I've grown his leadership position, the more I've recognized that you have to commit to the vision first. And then beyond that, physics is like decided what the job is or what the company needs from you. And you have to listen to those signals. And that often means maybe not doing the thing that is directly aligned with like your pride. Maybe I have certain pride in being hands-on in certain ways, and then have to recognize that, hey, that was working for the company. It was a good thing for the company for a while. And now actually it's getting in the way because I'm gumming up the gears. So the best thing I do for the company is actually stepping away from something that I would normally take pride in doing because I need to allow it to scale. And I think that aspect, that you, in some sense, as things get bigger, you have more power, but actually I think you become more of a servant to the vision, has been like an interesting, I don't know, like color of the professional journey for me.
Beautifully put, and really enjoyed chatting with you. Zach, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
This episode of Building with AI is brought to you by Autoblocks, the company I founded to solve one of the biggest challenges in AI today: making LLMs safe, reliable, compliant, especially in high-stakes industries like healthcare. If you're a company building AI-powered products, whether that's a virtual health assistant, AI-driven documentation, or any LLM handling sensitive information, you know the risks. LLMs hallucinate, they leak sensitive data, and in regulated industries like healthcare, finance, and insurance, compliance isn't just important, it's the law. So what's the challenge? Most companies rely on manual spot checking and vague governance policies. That's not scalable. What you really need is a way to proactively catch AI failures before they happen, before an LLM suggests incorrect medical advice or violates HIPAA compliance. That's where Autoblocks comes in. We're an automated QA and compliance platform for LLM products, purpose-built for regulated industries. With Autoblocks, your team can run structured AI evals, detect risks before deployment, and enforce real-time guardrails in production, all while maintaining auditability and compliance. We're already helping companies like Hinge Health, Pelago Health, and others scale AI safely. If you're building AI for healthcare, finance, or any industry where safety and compliance matters, you need to be using Autoblocks. Go to autoblocks.ai to learn more or book a demo today. Again, that's autoblocks.ai, the trust layer for AI in regulated industries.